Hey Keith, how's it going, man?
Good. How's it going, Joe? Everything's
Doing
good
very
here.
well. Yeah.
Nice.
That's good to see you. Good to
Yes.
see you. So yeah, we're gonna talk. I think all things data modeling today. So you're one of the people that
Love
keeps
that
popping up.
topic.
I know you do. I know you do. So it'd be a good chat. So I guess for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah. My name's Keith Belanger. I am currently the product evangelist at SQL but I have been in data and data architecture for close to 28 years. I actually got into data, I guess, say by accident, and I'm glad the accident happened. I originally went to school for I wanted to be an architect for designing buildings, and I got into AutoCAD drafting at the time. People were getting off of paper drawings, and I had discovered that you could save information about parts that you were drafting. And I just happened to express, like, hey, wouldn't it be valuable if we could get this information out? And they actually sat me with a data architect who sat with me for 3 days and said, before we do this, I want to teach you about data modeling. And he showed me how to data model.
Mm.
We actually were sitting in a break room with vending machines and stuff like that, and showed me how to data model. And I kind of fell in love and said, you know, how do I get into this? And I kind of went back to school at night for computer science, and I had him as a mentor.
Wow.
And the CIO of the company that was a small company, small manufacturing company in Maine. And they said, hey, we got to build one of these data warehouse things. You want to try it? Sure, I'm game for anything. And they actually sent me off to a Kimball class. This would actually be in 1996. They sent me off to a Kimball
Oh
class, and
wow, it's one of the first ones, I think.
yeah, it was. I mean, it was like 300 people. It was a big room, and yep. So I got the pleasure of having him autograph my book, and yeah, I learned from Kimball, and started out with that small warehouse and just kept on evolving from there. And I went from that small to a larger manufacturing company, and then I went independent consulting. Then I was at another insurance company for about 15 years to implement their large warehouse. Then, of course, we went into the NoSQL, and Hadoop came along, and um, cloud, and then that whole new journey. I started getting into doing data vault, and then I got interested in and what was going on in the cloud space to try to do their next modernization effort, and got into Snowflake. And this, so yeah, it's been a kind of crazy ride for the last 28 years, but I've played in many roles. I had to do because we were in some situations didn't have many folks. So I was one time I was the Oracle DBA, the data modeler. I was doing all the Informatica developing, and I was at the time I was doing all the Cognos um, development, and so it was kind of like a one man data warehousing shop. And so really got the ability to get my hands on many aspects of the end to end data process, and eventually moved my way up into just kind of more. For when I was at large insurance company, was more the director architecture and more strategic where we're going. And at that point, it was well over 200 people in the data management organization. So kind of went from a one man
Wow.
team to a to a point where we had 200 people. So it's been a crazy journey, but so much experience and so much great people to learn from and exchange information. And I'm always a sucker for somebody else who wants to talk data and sponge off and learn from what people have to share. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of about myself. So
A little bit, but a lot too,
yeah,
right? I think you've been
yeah.
around kind of the gamut of data since since the dark ages, really, or the enlightened ages. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how much is still the same, but how much has changed. And when I say the same in terms of like from a modeling perspective, it's still one to many's, many's to many's. It's still, but back then it was like you had everything was centralized, right? You went through one or two people, but you were only making changes once a month. To now, it's like if you're not reacting near real time and constantly evolving to meet your business needs. So that the role data played back then was kind of like it's nice to have, I guess. To now, it's such a critical component, and seeing that evolution has been it's been pretty interesting in just how do you morph and how do you adjust, with those skill sets and practices I learned back in the, you know, mid 90s to, how do they still make them relevant today, you know?
Hmm. How relevant are those practices now? And let me caveat this with saying that
Yeah.
it feels like, at least from where I'm sitting, that the pendulum in the '90s was, and the '80s too, was very heavily data modeling, and then it feels like in the 2000s, kind of in the quote big data era,
Yep.
modeling sort of took a back seat to something else, or to a lot of
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah.
And it seems like recently, in the last couple of years, maybe the last year and a half, data modeling has really become a topic once again. And it feels like I don't know if rediscovery is the right word, but it feels like people are revisiting
Yeah.
data modeling. What do you think happened?
Well, I have my I thoughts from over the years. I think, when I really saw it dropping off was kind of around the same time I saw two things come into play. One was Agile and NoSQL, right? So I saw the at least the projects and the people I was working with, it almost became a license to bypass modeling, right? It's you're a bottleneck. It takes too long. We were very waterfallish. So you really said, I'm going to model this entire data warehouse, right? You get 25 fact tables and all of these dimensions. And
Hmm.
then 6 months later, you come from behind the curtain. You say, I got it, right? and, and, and that model really wasn't good enough for where the industry was at the time. So they're like, hey, I don't need a model to do a NoSQL, structure. I'm not doing DDL. And then we're agile. So people would just started, building data sets and data products. I don't know if they were necessarily calling them data products at the time, but they were just building, right, and
Hmm.
delivering. And then what happens is the business consumer starts getting, great, you guys are delivering. And ultimately, I always tell people, we're in this business for the business, right? We're not here. I mean, as much as some of us like to be innovative and play around, and we're not doing this for the sake of IT. We're doing this because our business needs to be able to make decisions, right,
Yeah.
and grow their business. So ultimately, that's what we're here for. So if they're happy, and they were happy that they were getting this stuff, but then what I've started to see, hey, we start going to the cloud. Well, cloud starts being consumption based. You start processing based, and I start seeing now you're paying for all of that. For, I guess you could say, a little bit more of chaos in terms of, like, I have duplicate processes? Do I have duplicate data? Right? Am
Mm.
I overcoming bad relationships by, you know, writing procedures to clean up data? Right? I started seeing I've seen a very heavy uplift in terms of just data quality, because you're not putting in things I used to handle by doing default values in my DDL, right? Or putting
Right.
constraints and referential integrity and all of those things. All of those kind of disappeared, those fundamentals. And now you're paying for it with compute, right? Or buying, master data management systems to clean it up, to dedupe it, to whatever. And I think now, as you take a step back, organizations are saying, maybe there's something here that we need to revisit in terms of modeling and these concepts to kind of get back to, but the way I've kind of looked at it is, it's got to be a practical balance
Yeah.
between it, right? I mean, I could be a hard nose, this is how you properly model, and and it would be very frustrating. But how do we practically use these, concepts that were provided, these patterns that you can read about, all of these things about, well, these are modeling patterns, these are data warehousing patterns, these are data vault patterns. Well, how do you take these patterns and, for lack of better words, introduce them into the processes, right? In terms of your life cycle, so that I can get data modeling best practices, but almost embed them into that development life cycle. So the data engineer is using it without using it, I guess, knowing that they're using it, but it's to sit there and say, that balance between having that full autonomy, right, to do what you need to do, but introducing some of those best practices so that you can still, as I always tell people, put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? Is
Hmm.
that I have these parts and pieces. I mean, I can remember I was having, one data source at the time, which was like a mainframe system. And then that same company 15 years later had over 200 different data sources between, you know, Kafka messaging, API calling, still the mainframe, transactional systems. It like, okay, how do we go and handle that large, you know, we got into those three V's, right, for that period of time, right? The velocity, the variety, and I think it was the volume of the
Yeah.
big data that lasted for about 3 years or whatever that came. But so to me, a lot of the time is in trying to just think in organizations I'm working with is I've started with modeling is how can we take those modeling concepts, introduce them into people for the most part who've been educated and come to this point where they learned how to do Python, they've learned how to do
Mm,
Java, they've learned how to do Spark and PySpark and you name it, but we've never showed them, or they've never really learned on how to data model, how to take a step back and understand. As I like to say, data modeling tells me a story, right? When you give me a data model, it's like reading a book. I can tell you about your organization, well, at least what the data model is telling me about your organization. And if it doesn't match your organization, hence you got a problem. But to me, it's a storytelling thing. So how can I educate folks to embrace these concepts at the same time understanding that they bring value, but not slow you down, right? It is, I that's one thing I think is today modern, I think data management and data architecture today is finding that blend of kind of the old school and the new school and what's
yeah.
that mix in between.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the complaint I always hear, especially with the new crop of data practitioners, is data modeling seems very dated. It seems very slow and cumbersome, and I have a job to do, and I don't have time to
Right.
learn all this stuff, right? And you couple this in with new. I wouldn't say new, but these are techniques that probably weren't incorporated back in the time of Inman, Kimball, Data Vault, etc. Like you mentioned Python, that's data frames, for example. That's a completely different way of dealing with data.
Right.
It's still tabular, but
Right.
there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, I treat it more, data frames more as like clay for your
Right.
data, where you can just mold it however you want. You can transpose, um, columns and rows to your heart's content. Even rows, you can have named rows and so forth, right? So it's a
Right.
different way of dealing with data. Um, and so this is sort of a paradigm where a lot of data practitioners, especially in the 2010s, simply learned, pandas and R, and actually sort of eschewed SQL for a long time until
Right.
they realized they had to use it, right? So it's just so you're coming at, and we're only talking about analytics here. We're not even talking about stuff like software engineering, data models there. We're not talking
Yeah.
about machine learning, the modeling there. So there's just a whole new crop of ways to deal with data too that didn't exist before. And um,
But yeah, I mean,
yeah.
there was a period of time where it was the insurance company and we had data that was flowing off of the the devices that go into your car, and they're
Mm,
streaming every like so many snapshots of your car's vehicle like per millisecond, braking speeds, like, and the data was coming at, but it was quote unquote structured, but it was not like it was a really all over the place. So always being introduced to, like you said, these new ways and new formats of data coming in. Like I like your analogy of clay. And
mm,
the biggest thing I take away from data modeling and trying to get people to understand is, again, you could sit there and say, yes, this is how it should be done, but getting people to just take a little bit of a step back and just try to take a look at the big picture and understand, well, if I'm modeling, I'm going to use a clay analogy, right? If I'm modeling and we're breaking up building this statue into a variety of pieces, and I'm modeling this portion of it, well, how is at least my portion going to interact and connect to the other portions? Like to me, when I really take a step back on what is modeling, it really is, it's understanding how the parts and pieces need to come together to meet the business's need. And if I get hyper focused on just my data set that I'm producing and what I'm comfortable with, well, how does that data set going to be able to interact with another data set? Or how is what I'm doing for sales maybe going to interact with what's coming in from finance? And how can that person who's doing fraud analysis take my piece of data and their piece of data and put it together? And to me, that's the biggest thing I try to get people to understand is let's take a step back, maybe slow it down just a little bit, or even within your sprint, let's have a conversation part to not completely impact your delivery, but how do we take that step back, understand the big picture, even if it's in very small doses. You don't have to understand the entire enterprise, but how does my customer data relate to these other pieces of things? And I've just seen people sometimes not even get there, like, oh, I'm going to generate a hash for my key, and I'm going to generate an identity column, and then you're going to expect somebody to say, I'm going to join that data set to this data set without having to do some other type of, oh, now I have to go and recreate a joining set of data to make these two pieces come together, versus, hey, let's just take a step back and say how we're going to come up with our keys or whatever it is, so that even if you're doing, we
Yeah.
can still put it together, right?
Hmm.
So it is a tough thing to try to, like, I can be very passionate and old school because I've seen how successful it can be, but I also know it took, you know, hours and hours of time to do some of that stuff. And it's like, how do I accelerate some of these concepts, give people some, what is great with a lot of new tools is the ability to automate and to do certain patterns and to make things parameterized. Is, so how can I take some of these modeling concepts and put them into like some level of things that will pass in a few parameters or pass in some of this data, and let us, or let some of this stuff happen. You don't have to be educated on how to do it, but leverage it in your, make it part of your library or make it part of your tool set, and then it just happens. But I don't impact you because I don't have to re-educate you on these things. We just kind of put them in play, right?
Hmm. That's interesting. I want to talk about Agile for a second. You mentioned Agile. I been thinking a lot about the impacts of Agile on all sorts of things. I
Yeah.
think the intentions were great for Agile, but it seems like a lot of, I would say, software teams, and I guess by default, data teams who are impacted by software teams, because have been impacted by Agile, but it definitely feels like a lot of the rigor that may have existed back in the day, and by rigor I mean thinking, it just felt like software and I guess quote data. It was a lot more thoughtful back in the day.
Yes.
Through my observations and talking with practitioners and reading and whatnot, and now it just seems we're fixated on whatever the sprint is and delivering the features, and we sort of lose the context of the bigger picture.
Right.
What are your thoughts on Agile?
I I mean, I like Agile, and I've seen the success of Agile.
Yeah,
But at the same time, I've seen everything you talked about. There's been that decline in certain parts, and so I guess I could say kind of more like a love hate. Um, but I have also seen it be successful when
yeah,
people
for
do
sure.
take that what you're talking about into consideration. I mean, I witnessed when I started my data journey. Like you said, there was a lot of rigor on your operational systems and your transactional systems, right? But you know, they weren't. You'd never worry downstream if there was that the child table, that there was no record for it in the parent table, right? Referential integrity was just built into that system.
Yeah,
um, Valid values were built into that system, right? There were just certain things. And then when Agile happened, and like I said, and even when I started going to NoSQL, well, you couldn't trust that there was referential integrity
right.
anymore. You couldn't trust that there was valid values. Um, so I saw that, yes, you were delivering, but the quality of that data coming down. You were delivering more features, say for that application, but I used to use the term like, the data warehouse is becoming the sewage treatment plant, right?
Mm,
We're starting to the agile aspects of things, or the less of the rigor, was then translating that somebody else is, that impact is just flowing downstream. And what I find interesting is when I first started doing this, we didn't have the data quality systems. We didn't have master data management systems because there was proper, I could say, architecture going on in these systems that you didn't have as many duplicate customers, or you didn't have, because there was one that's the system that maintained your product, that's the system that maintained your. But as we started going towards microservices, right, and we started taking things and breaking them up into different, next thing you know, you have customer all over the place and product all over the place. So i I think Agile, you know, um, delivers great, but you still need to make sure you have design. You still need to have, you have structures. Like when I say structure, like just strategy in terms of how we're going to do things, and how do you introduce those into the Agile process. Like I used to say, I go tell folks, you can have a story in your Agile process
Hmm.
that says, model the data, right? Your story
Right.
doesn't have to be deliver the pipeline. So how can you take, so we used to, I found success when we started establishing kind of like a center of excellence. So even though if we have
Mm.
these much more agile teams, we've established a center of excellence. We've kind of established some patterns that each of the agile teams are going to leverage. So take a little bit of the full autonomy out, right, of each of these different squads, but have a little bit of that balance between a little bit of governance and I'm not talking about like data governance, I'm just talking about like architectural governance, and making sure we're having some level of standard, um, but at the same time that autonomy to be agile and deliver the business needs, and avoid as much technical debt as you can, right?
Hmm. Dumb question. Do you have a favorite data modeling approach?
um, no, I kind of let the use case and the business requirements and the story, the data, the type of data kind of tell the story. I mean, I would say if I was in a perfect world from a warehousing perspective, I really enjoyed the data vault way of modeling, just because how fast you can adopt to multiple different sources. But I would even be to say that like I like to be very practical, and sometimes I'll take a little bit of Kimball and a little bit of Data Vault, and how do you make these things work together? If the data is coming in a certain way. So, you know, in the perfect like ranking, I like Data Vault. Um, that these days for doing data warehousing, um, you know, in Kimball next, but I also like to say I like to be fit for purpose. So if the
Yeah.
best thing about the business needs a denormalized flat file, and they could put it in a pivot table, then hey, have at it, right? It's um, so especially I like to look at is with some of the, especially the newer platforms like Snowflake or even like Databricks and stuff like that. Is, I mean, I can remember the days with Teradata, we only had so many amps that we could work with,
Yeah.
right? And so you happen to be a lot of times the technical, you know, solution you are have to influence your data design. You have to sit there and say, I'd love to do it this way, but I have to worry about co-location and distribution of data
Hmm.
and partitioning and indexing, and that added a level of complexity. I see a lot of that has somewhat gone away with some of the, with Snowflake or like the Databricks, and you can get back to really designing what best fits the business. Um, and so I like, especially like for example in Snowflake, I can do a lot more with raw data, not heavily transformed that much, and then putting certain like levels of views and things on top of it that can be, I like to say that they can be thrown away, right? So I often use analogies like, I have a pantry or the grocery store. I go to the grocery store, I got organized this is my bread and this is, so it's organized, but I haven't made the sandwich yet. I haven't taken that data, but I've organized where the raw data is. And now I can make whatever I am delivering or consuming be fit for purpose. So if it means I need to take a little bit of this, and I have 20 years worth of data, but you're only looking at 24 months, then let me just serve you up 24 months. And if you change your mind next week, I can throw it away because I still have all that raw information, right? So if you look Kimball back in the day, you took all of that data and you've made these huge dimensions, you made these huge fact tables, and they just get so unwielding. And it was very unforgivable to change. So
Yep.
um, now it's like that balance of like, okay, let me organize this raw data and maybe I can make more virtual views, or even if they are physical, I can just do almost like a a physicalized view, like, okay, just give me this subset, physicalize it, or put it in cache, or whatever technology you're using, and serve it up. And then if somebody changes their mind, no problem, change a few things and then serve it back up. So, it's really having to evolve the design that you're doing towards also leveraging the technologies that you're using. So even though I said a while back with, like, for example, Teradata, it influenced my design. I wouldn't say like in a negative way, because but some of these technologies now I can influence my design in a positive way in terms of like, okay, I don't have to physically design that, like I used to, or build an ETL job to sit there and say rephysicalize and transform that data, because
Right.
now you can do that, virtually just on the fly, or with a view, or even like you said, making these data frames. So the abilities to use some of the modern techniques have said I don't have to go that far in my architecture, but I
Right.
still need to make sure that the repository of the data that you're getting, what can I do to make it faster? Like I struggle with this normalized idea that a data scientist spends 85% of their time wrangling data. I'm like, okay, that's a lot of money to be paying somebody to spend 85% of their time not getting insight from data. What can I do as a data architect to reduce that 85% down to a smaller number, but still give you the freedom to play with this raw data in the way you want? Because that number just doesn't sit right with me if I look at it from an organizational, tightening my belt perspective.
Oh, I don't think it sits right with most people, including the data
It,
scientists who've been hired. I know I jokingly call myself a recovering data scientist and have for ages, right? For that very reason, it felt like I think it's getting better. Back
yeah,
in the day, I think when data science was super hot, it was very much a situation where data scientists were hired, and oftentimes there wouldn't even be data for you to do the
right.
science upon. So you're out there scrounging around for data, and that's part of where the 85% number comes from.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's 100%. It's finding data, any data, so you can imagine you're doing something productive with your job. But that's changing, and it's. I think the role of the data engineer is sort of helped alleviate some of that. I mean, in a perfect world, the data engineer would be doing the gathering, cleaning, processing of data sets, and the data scientists would be spending 90% of the work or more, doing what they're trained to do.
exactly.
So yeah, and the platforms are making it a lot easier. I mean, you talk about Snowflake a bit. We could dive into that, but they stuff like Cortex, for example, and a lot of the new features. And Databricks is doing something very, very similar, right? Where everything's becoming sort of this all-in-one platform. So,
Right.
but you just got, as you say, though, you need to get the data. That's sort of the prerequisite to all this. And I think it's also one of the harder pieces. I know Bill Inman always rails about this with ELT, where half the time you barely transform the data, or most of the time maybe you don't. Um, but yeah, you got to get good data sets. I mean, what have you seen in your practices? How would you go about getting good data sets? And I guess to back up, what is a good data set? What's Keith? What is a good data set for Keith?
To me, a good data set is one data that is usable as it can be in its raw condition that it's coming in, right? If it's if I have to do a lot to it so that the business can use it, so that one is a concern to me. When you're telling me that that's supposed to be a date, right, and it's coming in as some kind of alphanumeric value, and I have to do something. So clean in terms of one is that it's the schema and the structure, as defined, is coming in clean. Um, that you have done. I like to say there's like, there's the soft aspects of data, then there's the hard aspects of data, right? And to me, the
Mm-hmm.
soft aspects are the stuff the business wants. Like, how much is your data matching your business terminology, and how much do they
Yeah,
talk, right? And if I have to do a lot to make it match your business needs, like, if the system is capturing A, B, and C, but the business is wanting X, Y, and Z, I often say, well, why aren't we configuring the source systems to call it X, Y, and Z instead of A, B, and C? Now, obviously, if you're getting third-party data, That's a different scenario, right? Because you're at the mercy of what they're producing. Um, but even from those, their data sets that are coming that I've seen from third parties are just um, the consistency that's coming. Am I getting full files? Am I getting delta files? Am I getting, and then if it's like, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's so if I have a higher trust, in that source of data that's coming in, that I can get it to the business faster, then to me that's a bit cleaner. And I don't mind if some of the rules of the data can be done closer to the consumption side, like if I don't
Mm,
have to physically transform it. But if you're doing things like, well, we've kind of taken all this data and we've compiled it into this one long string, and I got to go and kind of chop it all up, right? Because you didn't comma separate it, or you didn't put any kind of
yeah.
pipe, or you didn't do anything. And I just say, one through this. And when I talk about that, telematics data, when it was coming from vehicles, was kind of like there was just a big long string, and we had to like chop it up.
Ew.
And so yeah, so to me that kind of felt in the category of like, okay, you produce something on your side, it was quick, but it really has become very complicated on our side, and to me less clean. um so yeah, I've seen a variety of messy and clean data. Highly, I would say in the healthcare industry, I that data is just I it is just unbelievable. Like I would say it's a disaster.
Oh, I stay away
Um,
from healthcare for that reason. Don't even want to deal with it.
it, and maybe because I've spent a lot of time from a financial services perspective, and that data is a bit more. The structures are a bit more regulated. Um, Versus like I've seen some of the healthcare data, just how different providers handle their data, and it's just it's so in areas where when you have to do a lot of profiling, because you're trying to determine like what grain is this file at, like is this
Yeah.
what data is denormalized down, am I is there three layers of granularity here, is there one layer of granular, like you just gave me this one big file, and I'm trying to determine like what is the granularity, and that type of stuff to me is if I really have to spend a lot of time to understand this file, then yeah, that's a bad file. Like
Hmm.
I kind of sometimes say you got lazy on your side and you just, you know, dumped it all in. You probably made this denormalized view, you know, put it into a file and sent it on its way, but never told me like, hey, these first five columns are, for the customer, and next
Yeah.
these ones after that are this, and then like, okay, I have to discover it on my own by querying data and trying to see what's going on. So
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think it violates one of the things that you said earlier about data modeling, right? Sort of when you're describing it, which is it's how the parts and pieces fit together, sort of, throughout the business and how data is used. It feels like, and again, part of this I think is attributable to Agile. Part of it is attributable to organizational dynamics. But oftentimes, exactly what you saw, the telematics data, for example, right, that you described, that sounds like hell on earth,
yeah,
where it just, oh, here's a string. I don't know. Maybe they weren't anticipating analytics on the data, right? And
I
so
well, I think exactly that. I think a lot of these started as well. It's just proprietary for our, like, if I'll use OnStar as an example, right? OnStar needed OnStar's data, right? But now others started saying, well, I want that data, and guess what? Every vehicle, you know, manufacturer started coming up with their own
yep,
data for their so next you have all these vehicles, all these manufacturers all having, and it's such a new area. There was no standards. There's no, like, if you go and like, even for like I said, for financial services, how money is exchanged, right, digitally, right? There's a whole regulation, and there's a whole, like, this is the how you file, even in insurance, right? There's they call it the Accord standard. So there are certain areas where it's like, okay, if you're interchanging data in this structure, we're good. But then there's a whole area now where so many things are capturing data. There's just no way you're going to have standards across the industry in terms of how you
right.
do that. And so it's really left to the organizations who are trying to capture all this information to make data coming. This is all, for example, using telematics. It's all the same type of data, but it's coming at me in, you know, hundreds of different ways, and my business just wants to know how many of X, Y, and Z,
Hmm.
and it's taking me a long period of time just to make sense of the raw information before they can even use it to do analytics. And so that's to me when you get into that bad data, it's just those variety of um, structures for a variety of different industries and even organizations within industries that have a overlap on the type of data that's coming out.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the horror stories I heard down the street from me, this guy Aaron Niederhauser, he's got a company called Tuva Health, they're Y Combinator startup, but they focus just on healthcare data models.
Yeah,
And yeah, it sounds gnarly. I interviewed him once for the podcast, and I was like, this seems insane. So
yeah.
doing the Lord's
I
work, but man.
it just the terminology. Like I had worked for it was about a year working with a healthcare company, and my head was spinning because just talking to different people and getting multiple different definitions of what was the same thing. And I'm like, man, you guys are making my head spin. You're giving
Yeah,
me a headache.
it's insane. Kind of switching gears a bit. One
Yeah.
thing we were kind of riffing on, before the show was the applying data modeling to decentralized data
Mm,
teams. You may call it data mesh. You may just call it decentralized data
yep.
teams or teams in general. Um, it's a question I've been thinking a lot about. I feel like data mesh definitely represents a future, um, and a possible future of where we need to go. I think there's a lot of upside to it. But the question of data models has always been at the back of my mind. Like how do you model disparate data
Right.
sets for data products, right? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and obviously, right now working for a data modeling company, at SQL DBM, it is something that even we tackle. Like, what can we do to help organizations with modeling? Like these, because like I said, I lived through when we went from centralized to decentralized, and it wasn't even called data mesh at the time. It was just, we used Agile, and now each team could do what they want. And and even then, I kind of throw up our hands because I couldn't keep up with modeling. So and at the time, there was only a handful of people that had a data modeling tool, right? So next thing you know, I have, 13 different squads of people, right? I don't have 13 licenses of data model. I don't even have 13 people that are educated on how to do data modeling, right? So a lot of the things now is back to what I was saying a little while ago. How can we take these concepts and patterns and kind of disseminate them into these teams? And when you kind of look at data mesh and like the principles of data mesh, there's still governance in there, like that. And I kind of look in some ways as modeling being some level of a governance in terms of how you're going to structure your data. So how can we sit there and say, hey, as much as we can, this is how we're going to generate our keys so that we can connect our parts and pieces together. Here are patterns. you know Even if they're not like, let me use like type 2 dimensions or whatever, but even just patterns within your organization. How can we design patterns, establish patterns, but then disseminate them across, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so if we're all using a common modeling tool, I like to say define once, use many, is give people these patterns, give people these templates, these standards. Even, hey, let's just make everything uppercase, right? Or let's just make is establishing some of those things and then providing the capability to these teams to leverage these patterns, um, without, I would say, without thinking about it, right? Is to sit there and say, what can I do to empower as much as I can? Maybe I can educate a few people on these teams, but there's no way we're ever going to go back to like the old school modeling where we just don't have the time, right? We just don't have, you know, and so it's like, how can we take those concepts and then, you know, bring them into some of these solutions, and accelerate or even give these data engineers some tools. So, I don't know if the perfect solution is out there, but that's one thing we're trying to find is I like to say, taking, you know, long-standing best practices or things that have been there, and infusing them with modern techniques, modern needs of I always say the modern data practice, and how can we start to merge them together and find some kind of balance. And like I said, from a tooling perspective, how can we, what can we do so that, well, one is our tool will want to be leveraged to bring that to these data teams.
The education piece is interesting. Something I'm thinking a lot about too, and I think you're absolutely spot on. One of the biggest gaps that I see right now, and this is something I harp on quite a bit in my podcast and rants to this guy as well. But it feels like there's no shortage of good tooling at this point. I think we have great tools, whether you're talking for software, data analytics and so forth, right? And data transformations. I mean, there's great tools, but it feels like the ability to fully capitalize the potential of these tools is really hamstrung by maybe the lack of knowledge and competencies on teams. It feels like that's very much degraded. And when you talk to teams about data modeling, right, it's like, there's somebody on the team that says, "Oh, you just need to go learn, go learn relational modeling, go learn Kimball." But it
Right.
sort of misses it's like they're focusing on the tactical part, not on, the logistics or the strategy of how this is actually going to work, right? So it's reaching for, I think, the most convenient answer versus understanding where modeling actually fits into the workflows and processes.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, again, back in the day, it was kind of almost a standard part of your educational aspect to learn data modeling. And I like to call it the art of data modeling, because it's not really specific to, like, hey, this is how Kimball does it, or this is how Datavault does it. I mean, those are just different specific, like you said, tactical, techniques. But I call it the art of, like, understanding, what it is you're trying to accomplish, and the story of data. And we got data engineers and people that are learning, and right away we're showing people how to write, code, like how to write, Python or Spark or whatever, right? And how to I've taken some of these, like, hey, here's a data set, right, and convert it to this. But we've never taken that step back and said, like, to me, it should be like data 101. You should at least learn about the fundamental concepts of data modeling, so that you can understand, again, that big picture. And if we can get some of the data engineers and the data practitioners to have at least some of that fundamental concept. But it's like you said, the data modeling has kind of been slowly disappearing, and introducing that into the education part of it. I don't see it really there anymore. So now when I go and talk to the data engineer, it's like, you're talking old school stuff. Like, that's irrelevant these days. But what's not irrelevant to me is understanding data conceptually, right? And just understanding how the big picture of data. I've used this, like I said, the clay model earlier, but even like large ships today, they manufacture these ships all different places, and then they bring them to one yard, and they bring all these pieces together, right? Or you're building a large skyscraper. You could have the best, framer in the world, but if somebody didn't design, is not looking at the big picture, are you really going to be able to put these parts and pieces together? And the ability to have that vision, education around that, I think is lost. And I think the consequences of that are being seen by cost. We might be getting the top time to market, but I hear things like, "Oh, my Databricks costs are up there, or my Snowflake costs." Well, yeah, we're overcoming these things by extra compute, extra storage, right? So it, to me, in a perfect world, is like, how could we get just like the conceptual art of modeling introduced to people, even if you're going into data engineering or if you're going into data sciences, but understanding that ability to, draw that blueprint of, this is how what you're building for data is going to fit in the big picture of things. You're going to have to, the business wants to attach this to that, and I need you to understand that, so that thinking that it's less selfishly about the data you're working on, and how does it fit in the big picture.
How do you think that conceptually modeling should be taught and addressed these days. So this is something I hit on in my talks, especially last year. I had this whole data modeling is dead, long live data modeling. It was about resurrecting a lot of the, I would say the practices of the past, but maybe giving them a modern flavor. Conceptual modeling was at the top of the list, right? Where if you what I see too often is we start the physical model and you sort of
Yep.
end there as well, right? So I'm in
Right.
say Snowflake or Databricks, and I'm optimizing for micro partitions or whatever in Snowflake, and like
Yep.
that's sort of where people start and end, and the same with delta tables and so forth. But I think it misses a bigger point, right? Where I think over the 2010s, especially the one big table movement was largely in reaction to joins are bad, quote unquote.
Yes.
Right. So, joins are evil. Don't ever do joins. Therefore, let's throw everything to one big table. And what you saw was a couple things that happened, right? These models maybe reflected some aspects of the business, but then they became this Franken table where you kept adding on columns, and then you have the issue of data dependencies and duplications and redundancies, and then side effects if you want to update or delete. God forbid you do that in your table, but people do, and all the other things you can think of. You've been around the block enough, and so it feels like this was. So we're bandaging over a lot of things, right? But at the top of it is conceptual. Still, as you point out, this is the most important thing. And somehow the entire industry. So I would in my talks, this has been in front of thousands of people, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Just raise your hands and tell me, have you heard of conceptual modeling? Right. Maybe 25% of the room.
Right.
Logical, same thing. And so, and I show them. Okay, so here's an example of patterns. Right. So logical conceptual patterns you could start using. This is resurrecting some of the stuff from back in the 2000s, the Len Silverstein's 3-book series, right? But it feels like this whole. So we're doing, I think, a lot of extra work for no reason, actually.
Yeah.
So
the art of talking to your business, right, and from the top down is, you bring up Lynn. I use a lot of his patterns to help drive conversations, not technical conversations. Even John Giles, right? I've had many conversations with John, and he's attended some of my sessions, and I talk with him a lot. Just because
he's a good dude.
I like the way he thinks about things, and what's interesting is the conceptual model can probably be the most stable model if done right within your organization, because unless your business and your organization dramatically changes the line of business you want to be in. It is the model that, if done right, can really hold true, whether you're Teradata today and Snowflake tomorrow, and who knows what's going to be 3 years from now. The fact that I can have, I have customers and they can have many orders and stuff like that. But, and to your point, we so badly want to get to building something that, and I often hear is like, the number of times I've heard, we don't have time for that. And I'm like, you don't have time not to do that, right? But, well, we don't have time to do the enterprise. Well, you don't have to do the whole enterprise, right? If you're telling me we want to do, market basket analysis or some kind of retention analysis, okay, well, what domains of data are there? And then I used to call them stump the chump. Telling people you want to do a conceptual modeling session sounds boring. It's like, I used to call them, let's have a stump the chump session, me being the chump, right? People say, what's a stump the chump, right? And it'd be like, and I oftentimes would start out with, I'm going to put a conceptual model on the board or now on the screen. And I knew it was wrong. People don't respond when you sit there and say, tell me, about your business, but you put something about their business up on a board that's wrong. Oh, they'll let you know that that's wrong, right? And I would do it on purpose to drive the conversation, and then having that conversation with your C-suite folks, and having that same conversation with people that are, in the trenches of your business and in between, and you start to morph what really the role data plays inside that business. And at that point, I'm not even talking about source systems. I'm not talking about data warehousing systems. Let's talk about your business, and then you put up on a board and say, does that match your business, right? Whether or not that's how your SAP is working or your Salesforce is working or whatever, this is how you guys see your business. And they all go, yep, okay. That is really our target model, right? Now let's go look at this raw data and other things and say, how do we map it to that? How do we get it to reality? And having that model that data engineers and other people can reference. Once I've done it, the feedback I've got, oh my God, Keith, that is so helpful. It's just getting people to understand the value of it and being able to do it. But the number of people out there that the art of doing it, I think, is what's been lost, right? You don't have that many people that wouldn't even that know how to go about doing that. I mean, I talk. I don't know if you've seen I'm gonna not get his last name right, but Jua. You are
Oh yeah,
from
he's a friend of mine.
Jua
Yeah.
Ellie.
Yep.
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 I think he does an amazing presentation on conceptual and logical modeling, and it's like, if we could get more and more, forget about learning how to do, data vault or star schema. I mean, if you could understand how to do conceptual modeling, I think that in itself would bring huge value to an organization. Even if you are doing like you're decentralized from the physical aspect of it, you have to be all playing towards one common enterprise objective, right? Is somebody at that C-suite is going to be dependent on data coming from all of those different domains. But if we could all understand the big picture, even if you are decentralized, you're at least marching towards one, the big common cruise ship, even though I'm just
Yep.
working on one aspect of it. And that's one of my favorite parts of modeling is conceptual, but it's kind of been a lost art and a undervalued part of, I would say, a data organization.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, one of my peeves is, and I see this often, especially in data engineering, which is the world I come from, and but oftentimes, especially beginners, they'll ask, okay, so how do I learn data engineering? And somebody will just immediately throw Kimball's book out and say, just read that.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's not really helpful, because you don't learn how to talk to the business, right? And you're not learning the art of seeing, right? So one thing I'm taking away from my experience way back in the day with Lean and those sorts of practices is the art of seeing workflows and how things work. And to me, that's another way of viewing conceptual modeling, is just understanding, okay, so how do things flow end to end, right? What are the challenges? What are maybe potential bottlenecks in processes? But understanding what reality looks like today, that very well informs at least how you can conceptualize how data might also need to flow, right? Sometimes business processes don't have data. This is actually happens a lot.
It's sitting there, but it's that they've got it on a smart sheet or an Excel spreadsheet somewhere, right? And the amount of time, even in that in those conversations I've had, you start to hear, well, this is how we need the data, but unfortunately, this is the way we get the data, or this is the workarounds we need to do because we need the business to run this way.
Yep.
Right. And they know how they want the business to run and what they need to do to be successful, but the systems or lack of systems supporting that aren't there. So even when you're doing the conceptual modeling, you're like, well, this is really how you want it to be, right? Yes, it's like, okay, let's forget about analytics. What are you doing on the operational side of data to support what you want to do with your business? So that is, we often talk a lot about data from an analytics perspective, but we kind of forget that it has to be it's just as important at that operational side.
Yeah, I would argue it's almost more important because as analysts, you only deal with the downstream effects of that. If they get it wrong, you're dealing with telematics stuff at this point. It's just like, great, my life sucks. Okay.
Yeah. And for some reason, we're always talking about data architecture from an analytics perspective. Like I don't go to conferences anymore. Where are they on terms of, operational data architecture? I mean, we'll go to, all these analytical conferences, but where's the whole, art of data from an operational system, and maybe somehow we can get data architecture more recognized at the start of the creation of data, not just downstream at the analytical aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, I know that's one of the visions that Shamak had when she came up with data mesh, was really, sort of flipping everything on its head. And so you're developing data products so that the software and the data teams are the same teams at that point. And, in that case, then I guess data proper sort of goes, at least as we currently know, it goes away because it's all the same thing. and I think you're seeing some pockets of that working, but it's still not widespread yet. And there's a lot of I think more than anything, it feels like the organizational hurdles are the things that's probably going to get in the way of that. But that's the same as anything, really. I mean, that's why I think you still, as you point out, you have the operational analytical divide still, because like traditionally analytics has always been the internal facing IT function.
Right.
Operational systems are meant to service either the business or provide applications for users, and and so you just what they call it, like business exhaust, right? That's kind of what you get to
Right.
like sniff in, like you're in a car running in a garage, basically. It's almost the equivalent of it. So it's
Yeah,
not great.
and I kind of lived in that between world for many years. Like when I was kind of director of architecture, I had people that were on the operational side and the analytical side, and I could feel that tug of war. And a story I could always remember was the business from an analytics perspective wanted to do some certain type of measurement, and I said, well, we need to capture that data on the operational system. Like, I'll use customer shoe size as an example. It's like, oh, well, in order to measure by customer shoe size, we need to capture it. And you go talk to the application people, and they'll say, we don't need that to run the application. We're not going to enter that data. Okay, but you're all working for the same VP that wants to measure by customer shoe size, and so it's kind of like, we don't need that data to run that operation, but you want that data from a marketing and analytics perspective. And that's a short little sample, but that was the day to day, was like the battle between what they wanted for analytics and what was needed for running an application. So
That's how it is. That's
yeah.
how it is. I guess kind of closing out. What are you excited about this year?
Well, I know I'm excited about, for at least from our product perspective, we're attempting to hopefully introduce some features in the modeling space to help with decentralized teams. We're calling it global modeling.
Oh, I've seen that. Yep.
Yeah, and we're hoping that will be, starting to go in that direction of taking that kind of introducing some of the old school modeling capabilities, but in bringing them into the modern data practice that's doing a little bit decentralized or agile or data mesh. So I'm excited about that. I'm always excited, going out there for some of the conferences and networking with other data professionals. Always happy to learn and get more ideas. And you never know where data's these products, especially like Snowflake, Databricks, where they're going to go. I know a lot of people are excited about AI, and I'm kind of like, got one foot in the door, but really trying to see where it goes. I do think on that is exciting from a data modeling perspective. I do think AI is going to, in some way, kind of almost push organizations to be a little bit more serious about their data modeling, because the training of their AI in models are going to be highly dependent on the structure of that data coming into it. So I'm hoping, there's a part of me that is saying, hey, there'll be a more uplift in people being more interested in the data modeling side of it. But I'm curiously optimistic to see where AI goes in the data space. And seeing, I'm actually looking to see where real live use cases that organizations are benefiting from AI. So a lot of theoretical stuff last year with all of these, but I would love to see how organizations are really starting to, make real business decisions or impacting businesses with some real good use cases. So there's definitely a lot going on, and always looking to see where the data industry goes.
Same. So fascinating times. Well, Keith, it's been great having you on the show. Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite conversations actually in a while. So hit on a lot of good topics. For people who want to learn more about you, how can they do that?
So they can follow me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. I'm most active there. I do have something on Medium, but I don't write all that often. Writing for me, unlike you, I can talk for hours, but sitting there to write, it's like, okay, this is torture. I'm not a good writer. So I do have a couple of Medium things out, but they're not a lot. But for the most part, you can find me on LinkedIn, and maybe some podcasts like these and others around. But and I'm always happy to talk with people if they want to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks, man. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Joe.
All right.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, see ya.